At the height of the difficulties in Missouri in the summer of 1838, Sidney Rigdon, the first counselor in the first presidency, gave two very influential speeches. One speech targeted internal apostates. The other targeted external mobs. On June 17, 1838, Rigdon gave what was later termed the Salt Sermon, and a few weeks later, on Independence Day, he gave a talk called the July 4th Oration. John Corrill remembered the June Salt Sermon this way, quote, "The dissenters kept up a kind of secret opposition to the presidency and the church. They would occasionally speak against them, influence the minds of the members against them, and occasionally correspond with their enemies abroad. And the church, it was said, would never become pure unless these dissenters were routed out from among them. Moreover, if they were suffered to remain, they would destroy the church. President Rigdon delivered from the pulpit what I call the Salt Sermon. If the salt have lost its savor, it is of thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men." End of quote. John Whitmer, who at this time was labeled as one of those dissenters, recalled, quote, "They preached a sermon, called it the Salt Sermon, in which these Gideonites understood that they should drive the dissenters, as they termed it. Their band of Gadiantons kept up a guard and watched our houses and abused our families, and threatened them that if they were not gone by morning, they would be drove out, and threatened our lives if they ever saw us in far west." End of quote. Who were these Gideonites that helped drive out whom they called the dissenters? They are more commonly known as the Danites, named after the biblical warring tribe of Dan in the Old Testament. The Danites were an oath-bound military society organized among the Latter-day Saints in Missouri in the summer of 1838, who, like other antebellum frontier communities, had the goal to warn out undesirable persons and activities from their town. In Missouri in 1838, the undesirables were the unbelievers. Professor Alex Baugh is perhaps the church's foremost historian on the Missouri period, and has recently published an article on the Danites and their role in the 1838 Missouri conflicts.
There's legal justice and there's extra-legal justice, and they operated together. And citizens of a community would band together to take the law in their own hands if they felt justified in so doing. And I bring out in the article that one thing that was a common practice in the United States was warning out. If there's somebody undesirable, they had select men in the community. They're actually called select men. They're appointed or chosen, whatever, and they warned people out of the community if they saw them as undesirables. There was the decision by a group of people, a group of men, and they called themselves the Brother of Gideon, and they said, boy, we've had enough of the dissenters.
Today's episode of Why Religion is a fascinating case study on history, violence, self-protection, the law, and how we respond to people who dissent from the faith. I'm your host, Professor Anthony Sweat, and this is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Ryan Sharp from the Department of Ancient Scripture sat down with Professor Alex Baugh, who currently is the chair of the Department of Church History and Doctrine here at BYU. In part one, Professor Baugh will contextualize the rise of the Danites, the origin of their name, and their involvement in the Missouri conflicts, along with Joseph's knowledge or lack thereof of Danite doings. In part two, Professor Baugh will move more toward application and what we learn from this period of Latter-day Saint history, including the sacredness of Missouri, following the law and taking it into our own hands, self-defense, and the wise use of power. And in part three, he will share a little bit about his academic journey and his faith. So here's Professor Sharp interviewing Professor Baugh about the Missouri Gideonites, or otherwise known as the Danites.
All right, Alex, we're here to talk about the article that you recently published entitled, "We Have a Company of Danites in These Times, the Danites, Joseph Smith, and the 1838 Missouri Mormon Conflict." So this article details the events in Missouri in 1838, as the title suggests. However, I recently had the opportunity to participate in a crash course church history trip with you as our guide, and it was very clear why you're one of the foremost experts on the Missouri period in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I was hoping you could give the listeners a brief summary of that period. I realize it's completely unfair to ask you to take an entire career's worth of work and summarize it in a few minutes, but maybe just a few things. What led the Saints to Missouri? Why were they there? How long were they there? And what were some of the primary challenges during that period?
Well, thank you for visiting with me today. I do love the Missouri period. It's got a lot of conflict, some real dark days, but the Saints came through it, and they were stronger and better because of it. Now, there's purposes in opposition, as we all know. But it really begins with the missionaries to the Lamanites and their call in 1830, fall of 1830, to travel to the borders of the Lamanites. And they have made an arduous journey. Of course, they begin in October. They finally get there after passing through Kirtland, which is a whole other story. But they finally get there in the first part of January, 1831. So that's when we Latter-day Saints have now set foot on the soil of Missouri, and Joseph Smith had learned from Section 28 that that is where Zion was to be located, on the borders of the Lamanites. So something was going to happen out there. They didn't know, nor did Joseph at the time. But anyway, it begins there, and it ends really with the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints in 1839, midwinter, and early spring as they made their way out from Missouri. So we're in Missouri literally for 8 years, 1831 to 39. We're there as long as anywhere else, really. I mean, we want to say Kirtland. Well, they're really kind of there longer, even though there were Saints who stayed in Kirtland.
Are things dicey in terms of the conflict from the beginning, or maybe is there a story or two that come to mind that kind of captures that period and when things started to get ugly?
Well, because this place was the location of Zion, Joseph comes down there in 1831. He arrives in July of 31, designates Independence as the center place. This New Jerusalem, this Zion, that doesn't go over well with the locals, that this is where the Latter-day Saints fully intended to establish a Zion community. So it begins really, really early. Yeah. And we have some lulls, but by 1833, with the Mormon influx into that region, that throws a lot of red flags. And there were some outbreaks of hostilities, which, of course, forced them into Clay County. And then, like I say, between 1833 and 1836, things were relatively calm.
So by the time we get to 1837, crossing into 1838, what's the landscape?
Okay, well, things are actually going quite well at that point. But things deteriorate really beginning with the arrival of Joseph Smith. And he leaves Kirtland in early January 1838, arrives March 14th, 1838. I think that sent a signal to a lot of people in Missouri that, oh my gosh, here's the Mormon leadership. For all this time, they've been in Kirtland. Yeah. They're coming here now permanently.
So now this is really happening. It became a reality.
Here's Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Smith. Here they come.
Yeah.
At the same time, we had kind of had a spillover of dissent from Kirtland, and we had dissenters, of course, in the church in Far West, and that could not. I mean, where are we going to go if they try to bring down the church at that point? So the dissenters and the arrival of Joseph Smith really marked the the problems began to emerge in really early 1838.
Okay, and I want to come back to this discussion about the dissenters, because your article really, I think, underscores that it was the dissenters who were doing a lot of the damage in terms of the relationships, in terms of the persecution, etc. So we'll come back to that. Speaking about kind of studying any history, one of the challenges with reading and interpreting history is a challenge that I find we have as well. I teach in ancient scripture, but it's a challenge that we find when studying and interpreting ancient scripture as well. Specifically, we're often led to interpreting previous events and writings using our modern day lens, and sometimes this is called presentism. Reading our own cultural norms and sort of forcing them on a previous people. In your article, you talk a little bit about this, and I think it sets up nicely the core story of the article. And so in the article, you say, history is best understood when interpreted and explained in the historical context of the times. In the case of the Missouri Mormon conflict, it is crucial to understand the legal justice system in western Missouri in the 1830s. And then you quote William G. Hartley, who said, certainly in antebellum Missouri, if not in most states in the Union, a double system of justice operated. Traditionally, communities felt they had the right to control their own destinies, by law if possible, by force if necessary. Vigilante action, when enough in the community wanted it, served as a non-governmental enforcement of the will of the people, and state governments rarely interfered when local citizens vented outrage at undesirables. Latter-day Saints understood this extra-legal method of solving problems and even adopted it themselves when they were a majority, but they nevertheless resented being victims of it. So now enter Danites, or at the time, I guess they're not called Danites. Maybe talk for a few minutes on what you called the expulsion of the Mormon dissenters and the establishment of the Society of the Daughters of Zion.
You read a very important aspect of the article, and that's simply there's legal justice and there's extra legal justice, and they operated together. And citizens of a community would band together to take the law in their own hands if they felt justified in so doing. And I bring out in the article that one thing that was a common practice in the United States was warning out. If there's somebody undesirable, they had select men in the community. They're actually called select men. They're appointed or chosen, whatever, and they warned people out of the community if they saw them as undesirables. Now, it could take a number of types of people. It could be indigents or the poor or people who they just say, these don't mix with who we are. So the Mormons are used to that. Joseph Smith was warned out in Kirtland in 1833.
Because they're usually the victims of this.
Yeah, we've been the victims. Now we're kind of up there going, well, we're in control. And so there was the decision by a group of people, a group of men who banded together. They first called themselves the Brother of Gideon, after probably Gideon Carter, but Jared Carter was the main leader, and they called themselves the Brother of Gideon, and they said, boy, we've had enough of the dissenters, and the dissenters included the Missouri presidency, David Whitmer, John Whitmer, W.W. Phelps.
And is Oliver Cowdery in this group as well?
Oliver Cowdery's in that group. Oliver's got some real issues with the church at that point. And William E. McClellan, W.W. Phelps. I mean, there's some key players who are just kind of creating problems.
Yeah.
So they warn them out and basically say, you've got a few days to leave, and if you don't, we'll try to help you. They were successful, and they left the enclave of the Latter-day Saints. They were going, okay, now what do we do? And so they kind of begin to morph here, Ryan, but what they end up doing is kind of changing their names to this feminine term, which you talked about, but eventually they became known as the Danites, and quite frankly, years later, Joseph Smith kind of gave them that. I think it was more of a nickname, but I think they really liked it.
And so from where? Where did that name Danites come from?
Well, it's actually from the Bible, and It was from the group of who stole the idols. I have that in the article. I think it was Micah.
Yeah.
There. So he kind of attached the name to him, and I think that's when it finally stuck. So there was really three names.
Yeah.
The first brother of Gideon, and then this daughter of Zion, and then the Danite terminology.
So real quickly, because I think, and you mentioned this is an important point made in the article, but why do you think it's so important for our listeners to understand what the system was back then, that you had kind of the formal law and then you had this sort of extra legal, and it was somewhat accepted in that period in sort of frontier America? Why do you think that's such an important point for us to understand as we look at this story?
Well, again, if you understand that, then you realize that the Mormons are, again, and I'm using the word Mormon even though it's a historical
I won't
term.
tell the prophet.
But it's they're doing what's been done to them, and it's seen as entirely, I don't want to say acceptable, but they understand that, some people are going to take the law into their own hands. At the same time, we need to abide by the law. And what I've always said about Missouri is I think the saints really did everything they could, especially Joseph Smith, to do things within the parameters of the legal system, of law. I think they really, really tried. Now, did they go outside those bounds once in a while? Well, yes, they did, but kind of so did everybody. So don't sit there and just point the finger and say, gosh, how could the Latter-day Saints do that? Well, that's the way it was. And they were the majority. They had the majority in Caldwell County, no question about it. And in Daviess County, they became the majority. And so they ruled with not only the rule of law, but the rule of extra legal justice if it applied or it was necessary.
So in the article, it seems like the celebration on the 4th of July is a pretty significant moment in the history of the Danites. So what's going on there, and what was it that made this, I'm not sure if it would be a pivot point, but what made it such a significant period of this story?
Well, what I've tried to explain in the article is that the Latter-day Saints had every legal right to establish a militia system in Caldwell County. This is their county. The militia system was in place as given by the Constitution of the United States. Every state was supposed to have a standing militia. Today we'd call it the National Guard. In fact, that's where it comes from. So they had a legal right to organize a military body, and receive military commissions from the state. They are permitted and actually expected to do so. At the same time, there were groups which we call independent companies, which they could organize kind of these independent groups of militia, but they still came under the state authorities. They had to be recognized by the state, and this is what I argue in the article, is that the Danites finally say, well, gee whiz, we've expelled the dissenters. What's our next role? Well, the next role is to be maybe this military body that comes under the auspices of the state authorities. But the situation with the Latter-day Saints and the Danites is they never got that legal authority. They just acted on their own. But I think Joseph and the early church would have seen the Danites as kind of an alternate group, a special group that's banding together to try to organize a military group where they could take action as well as the legal militia. They never did receive that sanction or that authorization. So therefore, we would call it a paramilitary group. They were not authorized, but they were probably hoping to become such.
And so there's this gathering, and Sidney Rigdon delivers what you call the patriotic but also vitriolic war of extermination speech. And what does that lead to? What's the kind of result of this? Well,
and kind of go along with your last question, this marks the first time where we have the actual...
There's an organization.
We have a July 4th celebration, and it's patriotic. So let's have the militia, but hold it. We got the Danites too, they're kind of a militia body. Let's include them. So it's kind of the first combination of both the legal and the extra legal, if you will.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Rigdon gets a little bit overblown, and he overdoes it. It's a wonderful patriotic speech for the most part, but then he
pushes the line a little bit.
Yeah, and so that kind of marks the beginning. We like to actually say that kind of gets the ball rolling towards the conflict that's going to take place the rest of the year.
I love this quote from your article. George W. Robinson, who you mentioned kept Joseph Smith's journal and was himself one of the original organizers of the Danite band, wrote, and this is a quote, "We have a company of Danites in these times," which obviously is where the title of your article comes from, "to put to rights physically that which is not right, and to cleanse the church of very great evils which hath hitherto existed among us, inasmuch as they cannot be put to rights by teachings and persuasions." And then he concluded, "This company, or a part of them, exhibited on the 4th day of July." I love that. We have a company of Danites to put what is right, what currently isn't right, and you sort of you feel that passion that they have. And so what else takes place between this and October-ish of 1838?
Okay, well, I go in a little depth there, but not much in the article. But basically, there's several campaigns against the Mormons. And finally, of course, they have to call out the militia on several of these. And some of these are quite ugly. And this is what we call the 1838 Mormon-Missouri War. It's never happened in my knowledge of any other place in American history where a state actually comes out in opposition to to a religious minority. I mean, it's almost unbelievable to think that could actually happen. Again, I think there's culpability on both sides, but in the end, of course, the Mormons had to back down. We just didn't have the numbers. We tried to defend ourselves. We tried to do things legally and peacefully. Were Danites involved? Yes. Were regular militia involved? Yes. Were the Missourians guilty of terrible and gross crimes? Yes. I mean, there's guilt on all sides. But as I mentioned, I really believe the Latter-day Saints tried to operate within the parameters of law. Now, that doesn't mean that the Danites didn't do some things they shouldn't have done. And one of those is in October of 1838, they drove out every non-Latter-day Saint in Daviess County. Now, we would never do that today. No one would do that today, but that was the date and time. And Latter-day Saints drove out the non-Latter-day Saints. And then things really collapse. So
I guess two quick questions. Where does the extermination order fit into all of this?
Okay. That's, again, trying to summarize that rather succinctly. It's kind of hard. But what ends up happening is after the expulsion of most non-Latter-day Saints from Daviess County, there was the worry that the Mormons were going to march into Richmond and start just not be on the path to war here. And that was not going to happen. In fact, there's a lot of what went on in Daviess County Joseph Smith didn't even know about. But the point is, because of that, a guy by the name of Sam Bogart patrolled the line between Caldwell and Ray County, and he took some prisoners. The Mormons found out about it, said, we got to go rescue those guys. They're going to kill them. And a battle ensued. 3 Mormons were killed, 1 non-Latter-day Saint, 1 Missourian. The report that got back to Governor Boggs in Jefferson City was the Mormons had annihilated the entire group under this Sam Bogart. And that's when Governor Boggs said the Mormons must be treated as enemies and exterminated, or in other words, driven from the state.
Second question, going back to the role of the Danites in all of this, I'm sure anyone who's familiar with this group, known as the Danites, has the same question, and that is, so what did Joseph know, and what did he sanction? Where does his knowledge fit into all of this? Was he aware of all of these actions?
It's a great question, and that was really what I wanted to answer in the article is Joseph really behind the Danite movement? And the answer is really no. Did he know about some of their activities? Well, of course he did. In fact, he was with Danite leaders in some of them. But the Danite leaders and the militia leaders are the ones who are in charge, not Joseph Smith. He knew of some of their activities. He actually spoke at a couple of their meetings, but it wasn't, he didn't know of the secret teachings by this Samson Avard. And that's what I try to bring out in the article. Avard's, he's really undermining things, and Joseph doesn't know about it. He may have heard some rumors and things later, but it's not until Liberty Jail that he hears of all that Avard was trying to scheme, and some of his bad practices. I don't know how to say it. So Joseph clearly knew of them. And again, they weren't sanctioned, but he thought they were doing okay in some instances and doing some good things, but he didn't know all that was going on. And he does not head him up. And there's other historians who said Joseph's behind it all, and he isn't at all.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as this publication, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place for you to check out. For a moment, let's go to the other side of the world from Missouri, over to the island of Oahu, Hawaii. Similar to Missouri, Oahu, Hawaii shares sacred history for the Latter-day Saints. Built amid sugarcane fields and dedicated in 1919 sits the Laie Hawaii Temple. This temple was at the forefront of a church-wide shift away from gathering to the Intermountain West. This temple was also among the first brought to the people, and for decades it stood as the closest temple geographically to half of the planet. One of the first Latter-day Saint temples to accommodate large numbers of patrons from different cultures speaking different languages, it has been one of the most ethnically prodigious temples of the latter days. There's a new book called The Laie Hawaii Temple, A Century of Aloha by Eric John Marlowe and Clinton Christensen that commemorates the Laie Hawaii Temple's 100th anniversary and shares the remarkable history and contributions of this beloved temple. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Professor Ryan Sharp interview Professor Alex Baugh on his research article, quote, "We have a company of Danites in these times," end of quote. For part 2 of Why Religion, we like to explore why this research matters to the everyday saint and what are some potential lessons learned from this research. So here's Professor Sharp and Professor Baugh talking about this subject.
So what are one or two things, and I know that this could be a massive list, but what are one or two things that you would hope Latter-day Saints would understand and feel about this time period?
Well, as I like to say, Missouri's pretty special. And the reason I say that is it has an ancient, historical, sacred past. I really believe that. I believe this is where we have the beginnings of Adam and Eve and the human family as we know it. It has a historical past in regards to the Restoration and the early period of the church. But maybe even more important in some ways, Ryan, is that it has a future. Yeah. Something's going to happen in Missouri. This is Zion. It will not be moved out of her place. That's the scriptures tell us that. There's marvelous events yet to happen in Missouri, and to understand how that will be, I'm not sure, but I think an understanding of the past can help us understand what might take place in the future.
That's a beautiful thought. With regard to the specific research you did in this article, why do you think these things with the Danites and this conflict, why do you think that matters so much? So what do you hope the listeners would take from your study of the Danites and their role in the Missouri Mormon conflict?
I just want the Latter-day Saints to understand that these people lived in a different time, a different place, different conditions, socially, culturally, politically. Like we began, you can't see. You've got to try to interpret history through the context of the time, historical context of the times. If you can do that, you can come up with a more accurate picture and interpretation. But one thing about the Latter-day Saints is I think you've got to give them credit. They tried to always obey the law. Joseph believed in that. I mean, we have an article of faith in that. But at the same time, could they take the law into their own hands? Was there times in which God justified self-defense? That's why I call the 1838 Mormon defense in northern Missouri. Look at what verse 11 says in section 134.
We believe that men should appeal to the civil law for redress of all wrongs and grievances, where personal abuse is inflicted, or the right of property or character infringed, where such laws exist as will protect the same.
But look at this condition.
But we believe that all men are justified in defending themselves, their friends and property, and the government, from the unlawful assaults and encroachments of all persons in times of exigency, where immediate appeal cannot be made to the laws and relief afforded.
If somebody's attacking you, you probably have a right to go after
Defend
them.
yourself, yeah.
Defend yourself. So I just think we need to exonerate the saints. These are good people, most of them. And they're trying to live the gospel. They're trying to be honorable citizens. But when push came to shove, it's kind of like a dog in a corner. You pester him enough, he'll strike back. And the saints had been driven from Jackson County, politically removed from Clay. Now they're trying again. It was time to kind of hold their ground, and they tried to do so.
As we wrap up part 2, and as Professor Baugh mentioned a man named Samson Avard, who was a leader of the Missouri Danites, I want to share one other applicable lesson from this episode of our history. A few months after the Mormon-Missouri War of the fall of 1838, Joseph Smith will be imprisoned in Liberty Jail. While he's there, he writes, quote, "We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion." End of quote. To whom did Joseph have in mind when he wrote these lines? Well, there's a lot of possibilities, but just a few pages later in the very same letter, Joseph writes, quote, "And again, I would further suggest the impropriety of the organization of bands or companies by covenants or oaths, by penalties or secrecy. But let the time past of our experience and sufferings by the wickedness of Dr. Samson Avard suffice." End of quote. Referring to Samson Avard, one of the generals of the Missouri Danites and one of the primary leaders of the group. There's a great lesson here to consider also as you learn of the Danites about the wise use of power and the most effective ways to influence for righteousness. It is evident that by the winter of 1839, Joseph regrets the approach of some in the summer of 1838. If you want to read all of Professor Baugh's great research publication on the Danites, go to whyreligion.byu.edu, where you can find a link to download this entire publication for free. There you can also get access to past episodes and their publications. And remember that if you want to connect with us at Why Religion, comment and give insights on episodes that you've listened to, or see some behind-the-scenes photos and get bonus material, give us a follow on Instagram at Why Religion Podcast. Well, my friends, we've arrived at part 3 of Why Religion, where we like to talk with the professor about why the professor chose to be a religious educator and why they believe. So we wrap up this episode with Professor Alex Baugh sharing a little bit about his academic and faith perspectives.
So in this last section, we get to talk about you, Alex, and about your experiences and kind of what led you here to BYU. First of all, maybe just give our listeners a little background on your education. Where did you study? What were your degrees in? And let's kind of build on that.
Well, that's a long story, but I'll try to keep it pretty succinct. I'm from Logan, Utah, and I'm a multi-generational Utah State person. 40 years ago, if someone had said I'd be attending BYU or teaching at BYU, I'd said you're crazy. We were dyed-in-the-wool Utah State family. We loved the school. But I graduated in marriage and family studies, believe it or not, from Utah State. But it was while I was on my mission, I went to Virginia and I caught the history bug. And that's another long story. I came back, began taking a few history classes, but I was far enough along in my program and decided I'll just finish in marriage and family studies and see where that takes me. I got in the seminary program, and the first month or two after I was teaching seminary at Viewmont Seminary in Bountiful, I got a letter saying that they were going to start a Masters of Western American History program, a master's program in Western American History. I go, wow, I had to apply. So I came down, I talked to the department chair, and he says, well, you have no experience. You're not in that. So I had to, he said, if you'll take some classes and see how well you do, maybe you could get back, maybe you could get in the program. So I took a couple of years, came down here in the afternoons, summers, took some classes, kind of basically started another major, even though I'd graduated. After a couple of years, I did a senior project, and he said, I think we can put you in. So I was admitted to the Masters of the Western American History program at BYU. I took 4 years to complete that, 2 in coursework and 2 to write my thesis. And then I applied for the doctoral program here in American history and was admitted there. And so my path was a little different than most, but I'm so glad I changed to history. It was really something that I really, really enjoyed.
Yeah. So from there, so you complete your doctorate, and then did you go back to teach in seminaries and institutes, or did you move into the religion department here at that point?
Well, when I came down here, I got the BYU bug, and I was here 4 years working on a degree and trying to pass my orals and comps and orals, and I didn't finish. I was done with everything, but I had to still finish my dissertation. But the time was still teaching in the church educational system. They sent me to South Carolina. So I was there for 3 years. So I was here 4, there 3, and you had to finish up in 8 years. So I appealed and said, could you bring me back and help me finish? I have 1 year left. I've got to finish my dissertation. Can you help me? And they said, well, if we bring you back, can you finish? I said, I have to. So they brought me back for 1 year. And it was during that time I finished it up. And while I was here, one of the faculty members died, and they asked me to apply, and I was given that opportunity to be on the faculty. So I never fully anticipated I would ever be here, but it was just a wonderful, it was just a wonderful thing that happened to me. I was very fortunate.
So in a day where faith is being challenged, church history is being questioned, all of these sorts of things, as a historian, as a believer, as someone who has looked at all of these sources, been involved in Joseph Smith papers and seen, as much as anyone can see on the original documentation, what is it that grounds you in the restoration? Why do you choose to believe?
Well, quite frankly, this has been a wonderful journey for me, and I think the study of history and the doctrine of the church has really solidified and deepened that testimony. It's kind of hard for me to understand how somebody can't figure it out and actually know, because if you just look deep enough, gosh, it's fantastic. Joseph Smith gets better and better in my eyes.
So this is sort of the, and then I'm going to interrupt, but I love, was it Richard Turley who said, don't study church history too little?
Studying church history is a dangerous thing, therefore you better get a lot of it, or something like that. A little knowledge of the church history is a dangerous thing, therefore you better get a lot of it. Yeah. And I kind of have a motto or a little saying in my family. I go, if you don't know Joseph Smith's not a prophet of God, you haven't done your homework. Oh my gosh. He is so incredibly, he just gets larger and larger and larger. I sit there and I look at the Revelations. I go, man, Section 76, Section 88, Section 93. No mortal can compose that. There is no, you see Joseph's writings as Joseph as a man, but his revelations are just off the charts. How can someone not see that man is not inspired of God? So anyway, it has really deepened my testimony and my conviction. The more I learn, the more I study, the more I believe. And you have to study in faith. There's no question there. But if you do that, how can you miss that he's certainly not perfect by any means? He admitted it himself. And you see some areas of Joseph Smith's life, probably made a few mistakes, obviously. But, oh my gosh, he just gets almost larger than life. He's absolutely an amazing individual. And I think Section 135, all that he's done for the salvation of man, more than any other man save Jesus Christ. I think I can say that with ultimate conviction.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes, from Brigham Young University, Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.